Now let me turn to a continent from which almost everybody in this room came from ancestrally, all right? That is, anybody doing a racial study would look at this room and say, this is a bunch of Europeans. That is, our roots, our ethnic roots, do not lie in North America. They lie in a continent which sometimes we cultivated as the enemy, the American, the European. But in reality, the culture of the United States of America is an extension of Europe and European culture. Now, of all the continents, Europe is the second smallest. And yet historically, and that's very interesting because we have to explore it in terms of understanding what's happening in Europe today, historically it's the most powerful. Because it is the only continent in the world which went out to conquer the rest of the world and succeeded. There was a time at the beginning of the 20th century when virtually the entire world was under European control. If you look at North America, the people who lived in North America and conquered North America had come from Europe. If you look at South America, the people who ran South America came from where? From Europe. If you look at Australia, the people who took the land and ruled it came from Europe. If you looked at Africa, it was divided up into a series of colonies, some colored pink and others colored purple, whatever it be. The whole continent was controlled by the British and the French and the Portuguese and maybe a little bit by the Spanish and the Italians. And if you look at Asia, there again, all of northern Asia, I went through it. All of northern Asia, which we call Siberia, you know, the whole piece of northern Asia was invaded by and conquered by the Russians who came from where? Who came from Europe. And if I look south of it at India, it was under British control. I mean, most of Asia was under European control. So what we're looking at is a very, very interesting phenomenon. A continent that became so powerful that it went out to conquer the world. Now, the power of Europe is reflected today in the power of European languages. At the United Nations, most of the languages in use, even by people from Africa or Asia, South America or North America, are what? European languages, mainly that came from a little itsy-bitsy part of Western Europe. They're speaking either English or French or Spanish or Portuguese. I mean, there they are. I mean, the domination of European languages. On my trip this summer, I mean, you know, you can go off to Western China in the middle of nowhere. Somebody's practicing his English. The second, of course, is the huge diaspora, European diaspora, that has spread all over the world, and the places where Europeans are the places where they tend to be in control, either, if not politically, but certainly economically. The power of Europe lies in the fact that it was the continent that produced, for the first time, an enormously large middle class. And the middle class and the bourgeoisie are the most powerful forces for the transformation of the economy. It was in Europe that the economic structure that we call capitalism emerged, and which has now spread all over the world. I can go off into the deepest reaches of China. Do you understand? And there they are. They're now into running their lives in accordance with what I would call the principles of the free market. And it's sometimes frightening for people, but there it is. It started in Europe. It was in Europe at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century that the Industrial Revolution took place. It started in Britain and spread ultimately to Central Europe and then Eastern Europe and then across the ocean to North America and then around the world. It was in Europe that the procedure which accompanies capitalism and which has given what I would call knowledge power to the people of the European continent, science, it was there that it began. And very important, because it defines European culture today. Otherwise, the transformations that have occurred would not be there. European culture was the only culture, most likely, in the world that featured what I would call a strong secular sector, where there was a part of life which was not completely and totally dominated by religious authority. And I will talk more about that as we proceed. And it was in Europe that a form of government which is now praised at the United Nations, every one of the government leaders who got up used the word at least once. A form of government called democracy emerged. It didn't emerge in Asia, it didn't emerge in Africa, didn't emerge in North America or South America. It emerged in Western Europe. So this continent, this little thing, is enormously powerful. Now, I do want to confess something. I mentioned it on Tuesday. Europe is not really a continent. It's a continent because the people of Europe don't want to be connected to Asia. I mean, there is a continent called Eurasia. This boundary here, there's no boundary here. Europe is simply like a big peninsula, do you understand, sticking out from Asia. Historically, it's been part of Asia, and one can justifiably call it Eurasia. But over time, because of cultural reasons and political reasons, this thing called Europe was separated in people's minds from Asia and has now become its own entity. Now, the roots of Europe lie, or what happened in Europe, lie in 5 things, and I want to go over them. The first is its geography. Now, most of Europe lies at the latitude of Canada. Do you understand? If you're looking at Europe, you're not looking at the United States of America. If I'm looking at North Carolina, I'm somewhere down in Morocco. People don't realize that when you look latitudinally. Europe corresponds pretty much to Canada. Most of Canada is unusable in terms of human habitation. It's simply too cold. In fact, I think half the Canadians have vanished. They're in Florida or somewhere. I mean, they don't want to, now with prosperity, they don't want to stay there. So you're looking at a continent which should be covered with ice and frozen. And certainly now the earth is warming up, but there was a time when it was enormously cold. If you went at the same latitude to where I went this summer to Siberia, most of the things that happened in Europe would not have been possible. And the reason why Western Europe in particular has been so creative, because Russia at the same latitude is colder. The farther east you get, what? The colder it gets. I've been in Paris at the end of December and I've worn no coat. I can walk the streets of Paris without a coat. I've been in London and it's been fairly warm. Well, London is at the latitude of Winnipeg. If I went to Winnipeg at the end of December and wore no coat, I wouldn't be here. I mean, it would have been the end. So the key to the European story, which is rather interesting, is this wonderful gift of North America to Europe. It's called the Gulf Stream. It starts as this warm current that starts in the Gulf of Mexico, crosses the Atlantic, and then embraces and caresses the western coast of Europe, rendering Western Europe at a latitude where most countries are frozen, rendering it a habitable and useful place. And very interesting, because without it, without that Gulf Stream, the whole story of Europe would have been different. Another thing is that Europe is well watered. Most of the continents, other continents in the world have these huge deserts. If you go to Asia, large parts of Asia are unusable for agriculture or anything. I mean, just covered with desert, the Gobi Desert, the Taklamakan Desert, whatever, the Rajasthan Desert. If you go to Africa, you've got the what? 1/3 of the continent is covered by the Sahara. I mean, even in America, you've got Arizona and New Mexico. I mean, we love it now because we have the technology to go and exploit it, but if you're trying to farm and you're at a fairly primitive level, it's what? It's not very useful. Europe is well watered. I mean, there are a few spots in Europe that are dry. Certainly on the plateau in Spain, you will find dryness, but on the whole, Europe is a well-watered continent, and therefore friendly to the development of agriculture and sustaining a fairly large population if it's warm enough. One of the characteristics of Europe, which is very important for understanding its development in history and still, is that in southern Europe there is this range of mountains. In some places they're called the Pyrenees, in other places the Alps and the Apennines, in other places the Carpathians, but it's a fairly mountainous place. And then you descend from the mountains. All the great rivers of Europe come down from the mountains and head north as they do in Siberia. They head north to the Baltic Sea and to the North Sea. And northern Europe is this plain. In fact, drawing national boundaries in that plain is difficult because there are no natural boundaries, natural barriers. You can go all the way from northern France all the way to eastern Russia, and it's what? It's flat, just plain flat. The area is generally covered by forest, but it is still flat. One of the things about Europe which is very important is that despite the smallness of its size, and by size, its total size, it's not much bigger than Canada. Think of all the countries in Europe. Not much bigger than Canada is the coastline. Do you see all the inlets and bays? I mean, if you look at the coastline of Asia or Africa, it doesn't have as many indentations. All these indentations provided for the development of separate places and separate countries and separate peoples, and gave access of many, many people to the water. And last and very important, by virtue of the Mediterranean Sea, Europe, certainly the part that was first developed in terms of civilization, southeastern Europe, where Greece is very close to where civilization began. Civilization, that is, the development of agriculture and cities, did not begin in Europe. It began in Western Asia, and in places like what today is called Iraq or Mesopotamia or Egypt. But Europe, or southeastern Europe, was right next to it, proximate to it. And therefore, whatever cultural influences started in Western Asia could easily come to Europe. The second root of Europe, and it's still there, is the fact that Europe was conquered by a people who most likely came from Central Asia. The summer, I most likely was in the very place where the European races began. It's somewhere on the steppes of Kazakhstan. And ultimately, the people moved westward. And there were people residing here where we're not quite sure who they were, what their language was. It was before civilization. They had no written language that we know of. There are a few remnants of these people left in Europe. One of them gets into the news every few weeks. They live in northern Spain. They were there before the Indo-Europeans came. They're called the Basque people. And they most likely are descended from people who were there before the great wave of Indo-Europeans. And there are other people in Europe who came after the Indo-Europeans, who came from the Mongolian race, and who later intermarried with the people in Europe, and so they don't look the way they used to look. Three of those people are the Finns, who were Mongols, Estonians. Our director is Estonian, but he doesn't look the symphony orchestra of Mongolia. But what I'm saying, the language of Estonia is not Indo-European. And the third is the nation in Europe that still regards itself as a great, great nation, the Hungarians. And so they came afterwards. But on the whole, the overwhelming majority of the people in Europe come from this single race that at one time spoke a single language which divided up into many dialects, and each of those dialects turned into a separate language. And they ultimately divided up into groups. So let me just mention the Indo-Europeans. They define the European scene. If you have a meeting of a European Council, these are the languages that you will hear, and they are ultimately all connected. The Greeks, they call themselves the people of Hellas, the Hellenes. The Latins, who ultimately produced the Romans and settled in Italy. The Celts, who at one time dominated all of Western Europe and then were squeezed off into the sides of Europe. So you have them in Scotland and Ireland and Brittany. The Teutons, who settled initially in what we call Denmark and southern Sweden, and then pushed down and took over most of northern Europe, and from the Teutons are descended the Germans, the Dutch, the Scandinavians, and the English. And then in the eastern part is the Slavic world. The Slavic world is the Eastern world, and from them came the Russians and the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Czechs and the Slovaks. And then there is a small group of people who live along the Baltic, and their language is most likely the closest to the original Indo-European language. And these are the people of Latvia and Lithuania. We call them the Baltics. So, and all of them are related, connected. All their languages are connected. Lithuanian, Latvian, English, German, Latin, Greek, Russian, they're all connected, all related to this people who came into this continent and became the foundation population. The development of Europe, to understand Europe today, is to understand the great events that determine the course of European history. And we have to reflect on them because we can learn from them. There was the great defeat of the Persians by the Greeks. Had the Persians won the war in the 5th century BC against the Greeks, the whole culture of Europe would have been entirely different, because an Asian people would have what? Moved into Europe and dominated the culture. It was an extraordinary victory. There was the conquest of Western Asia by Alexander the Great, which established a small nation on the fringe of Europe as the dominant nation of the Western world. There was the defeat by the Romans in the 3rd century BC of a Semitic people in North Africa called the Carthaginians, which ultimately gave the Romans, who became the leading people of Europe, total command of the Mediterranean. There was the invasion from the north of the Teutonic people, the Germanic people, who ultimately invaded the Roman Empire and who destroyed it and who then began to fashion something new. There was the establishment in southeastern Europe, in the place of Greece, of a wonderful empire, which is sometimes forgotten, but which is at the foundation of European culture. At the center of it was a great city called Constantinople. It was called the Byzantine Empire, and its culture and power were very, very important. There was the establishment in Western Europe of an empire by a German king whose name was Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th century. And this great Charlemagne's empire became the foundation of two of the great Western nations who are so much a part of the European story, France and Germany. There was the great campaign. Europe organized itself in the Great Crusades and then moved eastward, invading the Muslim world, and the Crusades provided a special contact of Europe with the East, and out of it came an incredible trade. And from that trade, a prosperity emerged in Europe, reflected in the cities of central and northern Italy. And in fact, the foundations of what we call modern capitalism are to be found there. One of the great events, which was to shift the power centers of Europe to the West, was the capture of Constantinople in 1453 by Asian invaders, by the Turks, who took the entire Balkan Peninsula. One of the most important things was the arrival in Europe from China of something called gunpowder. Oh. Now the Chinese had been using gunpowder forever. Not for guns, but for fireworks. Well, if you want to find the source of European power, it lies in whatever imagination there was to turn that gunpowder into something to allow missiles to fly, and which gave Europeans a military edge over the rest of the world, enabling it to go out and conquer the world. One of the most important inventions in world history happened in Europe in the 15th century. A German by the name of Gutenberg learned how to do basically mechanical printing. Out of that came a phenomenon which is the foundation of what we call European science and mass education. Before printing, mechanical printing, how many people could afford a book? Who could read or write? Huh? Very few. I mean, what happened in Europe is something that didn't happen anywhere else in the world. Starting in the 15th and 16th century is the beginnings of mass literacy as a result of the invention of this mechanical printing, and that was to transform the whole picture of Europe. In fact, Gutenberg most likely did more to transform Europe than Martin Luther. I mean, you have to understand, because often we don't think about the technology people. We often think only of the people involved in religion or the writers, whatever. But here is an inventor. One of the great events was the splitting of Northern Europe from Southern Europe by the Protestant Reformation, which was to foster an intense war that went on for 3 centuries. And then certainly one of the great events happened at the end of the 18th century as the economy began to rev up under its new capitalism. The middle class rose up in a revolution in France in 1789, overthrew the French government, and now lay the groundwork for an entirely different kind of political structure in Europe. And in the 19th century, Europe was prepared to go out to conquer the world. But the European triumph, and that's the issue I want to talk about, the European triumph was ruined by something that happened in the 20th century. Many of us lived through at least one of the wars. It was that the people of Europe, at the peak of their power, went to war with each other. I mean, they had gone to war with the rest of the world and conquered it. Now they went to war with each other in 2 very devastating wars, the center of which was where? Europe. They fought their war on European territory. And when both wars were over, the continent was left Devastating. Whatever is happening now in Europe is a response certainly to the devastation of the Second World War. I mean, you can't talk about modern Europe without talking about that event or series of events in the middle of the 20th century. Now, one of the roots of Europe lies in Greek culture. Of all the nations in Europe, the one nation that had the greatest influence on Europeans everywhere. I mean, today, if I go to most countries in Europe, I will find public buildings with what? With Greek pillars. I mean, Greek culture overwhelmed all others. And so let me mention some of the things that were European. One was an institution called monogamy. Do you realize that in all the other continents of the world, men generally had, if they could afford it, more than one wife? Do you understand what the social structure is? We're so used to monogamy that we can't. What does it mean to live in a polygamous society? I mean, you have to go off to Iran somewhere just to figure out how this happens. I mean, the institution of monogamy was unique to European culture, and it was Greek. The rise of a strong and powerful middle class. These were the people who often ran the cities and city-states that were Greek. The rise, and this is very unique to Greek culture, and it ultimately pervaded European culture. We now use a word all the time. We think it's very American, but it has its roots to a large degree in what I call Greek culture. It's the sense that I'm not only a member of my family or my community, I'm an individual. And as an individual, I have rights. Oh. Now, that notion is not a notion to be found in Asian cultures. It's not a notion in Asian culture. Where family, do you understand, dominates. The notion of the individual and individual rights, which ultimately is to be developed, is something that can be traced back to Greek culture. One of the things, sports. When you go all over the world now, by the way, you can be in Novosibirsk, you can be in central Urumqi. They're out there doing soccer or football, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you have to understand the cultivation of sports in some organized fashion. The cultivation of sports is something that certainly emerged from what I call Greek culture. The levels of technology. Already in the ancient world, it was very, very clear that Greek technology was viewed by other people as superior, as witnessed by the way the Greeks themselves designed their cities. And again, I want to emphasize it. Although the Greeks could be very religious, the one thing about Greek culture was it was not dominated by a powerful clergy. And therefore there was this enormous secular realm that produced a body of literature and thought, including philosophic thought, that was not dominated by organized religion. It was a very, very unique development. Now, the last roots, and it's very important, of Europe lie in a people who borrowed a great deal from the Greeks. They're called the Romans. And the Romans did something which applies to the whole problem of Europe today. Way back in the 1st century AD, the Romans created a united Europe. They brought all, do you understand, pieces together. So they were all part of the Roman Empire. Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Gaul was part of the Roman Empire. Spain and Portugal were part of the Roman Empire. Their languages what? Reflect that, France. Italy was obviously part of the Roman Empire. The whole Balkans was part of the what? The Roman Empire, and Greece and beyond. And what the Romans created was a vision. It's a vision that's relevant to what's happening in Europe today. The vision that the Romans established, which never fully died, was the idea that all the people of Europe could be what? Unified under a single government. If they could, their power would be enormous. And by the way, the echoes of that were to be found in the Christianity which became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Because who is the most popular religious figure in the world, the most well-known? It's the Pope. Where does he reside? In Rome, and in fact, he's a kind of continuation, if you will, of the Roman imperial idea. Certainly in the Middle Ages, he was the symbol of the attempt to keep Europe in some way united. Charlemagne, when he established his kingdom in Western Europe, ultimately chose a title for himself in the year 800. He was a German, a Frank, but he went down to Rome and he was crowned in Rome by the Pope, and he took a title, which was part of the vision. But the technology of the time didn't allow for the vision. It's called the Holy Roman Empire, all right? So the question, and it's one of the biggest questions of all, it is very clear that given the culture of Europe, that it is and has been enormously powerful. So powerful that pieces of it went out to conquer the world. France, England, Russia, whatever it be. But the question still lingers. What would Europe be if all these people who have a kind of fundamental cultural connection could ever come together as a unified and united continent? Do you understand? Can you imagine? All those people, all that power, is it possible to bring British, French, Germans, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, is it possible to bring them together into a single nation? Oh. Well, by the way, at the beginning of the 20th century, if you suggested that, people would what? They'd laugh at you. But at the beginning of the 21st century, that's no longer a joke. I mean, when you go to Europe now, you're confronted with a currency. It's called the euro, or the euro, however you want to pronounce it. I mean, there it is. It's a European, it hasn't yet been turned into hand money. It soon will be. But there it is. Now that vision, do you understand? But what's happening in Europe right now is a reflection of that vision. So what happened? Meaning, the Romans started something unified. Why didn't it continue? Why do we have this hiatus? Well, that's the history of Europe. One of the problems was that the level of technology was such that centralized control was really not possible. I mean, they didn't have computers and internet and airplanes, and I mean, the centralized control was very, very difficult. And in the 8th and 9th century in particular, when the coasts of Europe were ravaged by the Vikings coming from the north, Europe became very decentralized. The only way people could find safety was basically in organizing neighborhood associations. And those neighborhood associations ultimately produced a form of government which we call feudalism. Feudalism simply means what? All the people in a little area are under the control of a what? A lord who offers them protection of some kind against whatever enemies there be. The second problem, of course, was religion. Christianity, which initially was a unifying force for Europe, you know, you put two Christians or Jews or Muslims in one room and you get five denominations, all already by the 11th century, Eastern Europe and Western Europe had divided into the Orthodox and the Catholic churches. And then in the 16th century, the Western Catholic Church split into the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. One of the problems was the historic hostility between the people of southwestern Europe who were Latin and the people of northwestern Europe who were Teutonic. And that hostility was one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation, and that hostility still continues. One of the problems is printing, and I want to talk about how printing did it. Gutenberg's, do not underestimate the influence of Gutenberg. If people do not read or write, then language is in the hands of a small elite. And when it was in the Middle Ages, they all used Latin. You understand? That's how they wrote to each other. You'd be in London, and you'd write a letter to somebody where in Bologna, and you would write it in Latin. But once you have mass literacy, then you can no longer have an elite language. Then you have to use the language of the what? The people in the area. And ultimately, there now was cultivated English and French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese and whatever else. And then you put it down in writing, and then you freeze it, and then you force everybody to study it in schools. And out of it comes something called national identity. And not only that, France at one time most likely had 20 different versions of Latin, which later on turned to French. But once you have centralized government from Paris, you can now force everybody in France to speak like Parisians. I mean, that's the spelling, that's the language. So ultimately what happens is literacy, mass literacy, instead of uniting, divides. I'm English, I'm French, I'm Spanish, I'm Portuguese. Now the crisis was evidenced starting in the 16th century with the emergence of strong and powerful nations in Europe. And each one had a turn and fell in conflict with another. The first great one, wealthy from the old world, was Spain, defeated by England and ultimately France. And then under Louis XIV, France rose, but ultimately was to be defeated by a coalition organized by the English. And then the English rose to power in the 18th and 19th century and became dominant. Their great enemy was a power rising in the East, the Russians, who were not successful in ultimately defeating England. But then in the 20th century, in Central Europe, there arose another nation called Germany, all right? And Germany is at the center of two wars. The two wars that were ultimately to devastate Europe. I mean, there was a vision at the end of the 19th century already articulated that maybe the English and the French and the Germans and they could all get together. I mean, the wars like that could be avoided. And all of it was aggravated by what made Europe powerful: the new economy, the mass movement of millions of people into cities, to Paris, to London, to Berlin, whatever they were, the decline of the old farm families, the emergence of a money economy that went up and down, featuring depressions, the rising prosperity of people, which produced expectation levels that could not easily be met. And now, the prosperity fed the armies of the nations, and a large part of the new wealth was directed to the production of weapons, right? And so now, what you have in Europe is not an attempt to unify. What you now have is national confrontation. Now, the 20th century featured two ways of coping with the crisis in Europe, and both ways tried to unify Europe and failed. The first was an ideal articulated certainly in the 19th century, is called socialism. The idea of socialism was what? To ultimately unify the working class, what, all over the world, but certainly you could start with Europe. And in fact, the ideas of socialism found political expression in an event which occurred at the beginning of the 20th century in Europe in 1917 in Russia, called the Bolshevik Revolution. And out of it came the communist government of Russia, which was to dominate the politics of the 20th century until 1991. Now, if you listen to communist propaganda, their propaganda didn't say, we're doing it for Russia. They may have been doing it for Russia. The propaganda of communism was always international. It was always what? Unite bring all the peoples together. And in fact, what was interesting in the middle of the century was that after a devastating war, the Second World War, the Russians and the communists emerged as one of the victors. So if you want to talk about what happened in Europe in the last 50 or 55 years, it's always in the context of that communist victory. The second attempt to unify Europe was another ideology which was the rival of communism. It originated in Europe. It started in Italy, it spread to Spain and to Germany. Germany became the major center of it. It's called fascism. In Germany, fascism turned into Nazism. But fascist ideology was what? What did Hitler want to do? He almost succeeded, by the way. When I was a child, I used to watch the newspapers, and you just watch the spread of the German armies. Do you remember? First it was just Germany, and then they got Austria, and then they got Czechoslovakia, and then they got Poland, and then they got Denmark, and then they got Norway, and then they took the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and then they were allied with Italy, and Spain was friendly, and then they moved into the Balkans. They got the alliance with Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. They seized Yugoslavia. They took Albania. They invaded Greece. And in June of 1941, to complete their vision, they what? They invaded Russia. I mean, so if you're talking about a vision, fascism had a vision to it. It ultimately was to do what the Romans had done, to unify Europe. But fascism failed in the Second World War. It was crushed. It was crushed, fortunately. It was crushed in the Second World War. And one has to ask the reasons why. Well, the fundamental problem with German fascism was its racism, its inability to incorporate other nations into its conquest. That is, it couldn't say to Ukrainians, oh, well, you want to join us, you'll be equals in the whole program. It couldn't say to Serbians, oh, please join us, the whole thing. Ultimately, there was an insufficient number of Germans to unify the realm. It's very interesting. The Romans were very smart. They allowed anybody to become a Roman, but not the German Nazis. In the end, that was to lead to their defeat and crushing, and Europe was left in 1945 a ruin. And what was interesting in 1945, and this is the setting of what we call the next attempt to unify Europe, Europe was left under the control of two powers. One was Russia and Soviet communism, with its ambitions to unify Europe and maybe the world together. And the other was a child of Europe, which had now grown even more powerful and which is now to dominate the European scene and which still, in some respects, does, although Europeans hate it. It's called the rising power of the United States of America, which enabled the Allies to defeat the Nazis. So now what I want to do, because this is to understand what's going on in Europe right now, I want to talk about the dream. The dream went back to the Romans. The dream is it possible to bring, do you understand, all the people of Europe together into one nation? And the rebuilding of that dream came out of the ashes of the Second World War. So please take 5 minutes and come back and I'll talk about that.
Why would anybody give someone they don't know a gift? They do it because this gift saves lives. And the need for it is desperate. We need over 20,000 people to give this precious gift every day. Please give.
Now what I want to do is take you back, for those who may remember, to 1945, because that's a crucial time. In 1945, European power was at a low. I mean, the Europeans had arranged to fight a war, do you understand, on their own territory. And most of it was burned down and destroyed. Its industry was, I mean, the whole thing. And there it was, the most powerful continent in the world. You know, smart people would have arranged to fight in somebody else's neighborhood. That's what they used to do. I mean, they fought in Africa and Asia. They burned there. They came to North America. But they had arranged to do it right in their home territory. And so the condition of Europe then was one in which there was enormous pessimism about what might happen. I mean, first of all, there was just this utter exhaustion. There was this poverty and exhaustion that was not only in Germany. I mean, Great Britain won the war, but it basically lost the war. It never recovered from the effects of the Second World War. It ceased to be a great power, most likely at the end of the First World War, but that was confirmed at the end of the Second World War. The only reason why it could defeat the Germans was it finally acquired the assistance of the United States of America. And the other thing was that the dominant power in Europe, because in 1945, the only power that had atomic weapons, I mean, it was only going to take a few years, but I mean, the only power that had nuclear weapons was the United States of America. Its country had not been devastated. In fact, and it's ironic, the war was a stimulus to prosperity. Do you remember? Most of the fortunes that I know of were made during the Second World War. That's what triggered the whole thing. The people were poor before the Second World War. The Second World War was the trigger. And then prosperity followed from that period of time. America is on a roll. And now the dominant power, certainly in Western Europe, is not even a European power, which reverses the role. The Europeans were accustomed to being colonial masters. And now they were not under American occupation, but it was very, very clear if you were going to have a major meeting, if you were going to have the capital of the world before World War II, where was it? In Europe, Geneva. If you were going to have the capital of the world after World War II, where's it going to be? New York, it's still there, right? It's New York City. The Americans came, and now it was very clear the leaders of Western Europe had to dance somehow or other to the American tune. That's sort of humiliating. Now, one could console oneself by saying, well, Americans are really Europeans. They're just Europeans that moved across the Atlantic. You know, they speak English and the whole thing, so they're really Europeans. They're our brothers. And in some respects, that's true. The most successful nation of European culture in the world today is the United States of America, but it was outside of Europe, and it was annoying. The reversal of fortune. I mean, the people who have not yet recovered from that reversal, they can't stop being nasty, are the French. I mean, it was expressed in Charles de Gaulle. I mean, the thought that France had been placed in a second place or third place situation was absolutely intolerable. So this whole thing. Right. The third was Europe was now divided by the Cold War. Another war now arrived, not as hot as the Second World War. It turned hot from time to time. And it now divided Europe. One of the ways to cope with European distress was a vision for unifying Europe called communism. And it was very successful. By the end of the Second World War, it had not only Russia and all of Northern Asia, because Russia extended to the Pacific Ocean. It had almost all of the Balkans, with the exception of Greece, and it had large sections of Central Europe. It had Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and allied with it for a while was Yugoslavia. I mean, from the Russian troops in East Germany to the French border was only a matter of what? A few miles. And it was very, very clear. There was now this confrontation. And the people of Europe were going to be in the middle of another war. And in fact, the boundary between the Soviet-occupied part and the Western part was called by Winston Churchill an Iron Curtain, which in a sense it was. It was impenetrable. I mean, I couldn't travel into it until the late 60s, the early 70s. You couldn't move into it. It was closed to the rest of the world, this barrier that was put down there. And what was very interesting was, because of the Cold War, immediately after the Second World War, large amounts of public wealth were again devoted to weapons and armaments. That is, it is true that the development of armaments can be a stimulus to the economy, but in the end, that is not the most productive use of the wealth. And now, all this money, I mean, you can see the problem with Russia. And what an embarrassment when you think of the the television tower and the Kursk submarine and what happened. I mean, the Russians took whatever wealth they had. They did not invest it in developing their consumer culture or their consumer infrastructure in any way, shape, and form. They invested it in their military and armaments, and for a while they were able to intimidate. But now even that is crumbling, because in the end that has to rest also on a vibrant consumer culture, and that never existed, but that's it. And in addition, on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, the ideas that had emerged in Western Europe of what we call democracy and individual freedom and so forth were now cast aside, although the words were still used. And now very, very tyrannical and repressive governments emerged, to the point that two separate European cultures were now developing. One, what we call the communist authoritarian culture, and the other is that Western European culture, now to be deeply influenced by the United States of America. And you can see the problem. If you go to Germany today, Anybody who travels in Germany today and crosses from West Germany into the former East Germany, you can still see the thing. The people in East Germany have not yet recovered from that culture. I mean, their resentments and hatreds, and we'll talk about them, is a function of being on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Had that Iron Curtain continued for another 100 years, the East Germans would have turned into a what? A separate and distinct nation. The mixing most likely would have been almost impossible. Now, in the midst of all this pessimism, it's hard to imagine a unified Europe with that condition. Something happens that triggers the beginning of it. So let me mention the triggers. First of all, the United States of America had an overwhelming vested interest in unifying all the nations of Western Europe against the Russians, right? And, in fact, the Americans were perfectly willing to include the Germans. They didn't have all the Germans, they had the West Germans. But they needed the West Germans because they were terrified. They had to hold back the Russians. So within 4 years after the end of World War II, they turned West Germany into an independent country with a leader called Konrad Adenauer, and within a few years, they had an army of their own, a West German army. Of course, it was supposed to be defined in such a way that you couldn't see the similarity between it and the army before, but there it was. The Americans needed every available nation. So the initial trigger for the unification of Europe came from the Americans, from our military purposes, our need to offer resistance to the Russians. So we simply got them all together. Who could resist? In those days, what the Americans wanted, the what? The Americans got. So the British and the French and the West Germans and the Dutch and the Belgians, they were all, and the Italians, they were all brought together. Now, of course, they too were fearful of the Russian advance. They needed the Americans to protect them. There was great fear in France and Italy of large communist parties that had emerged. So there was a desire on both sides. And out of that came an organization which still exists. It's the first trigger to the development of European unity. It's called the North American Treaty, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it what? It crosses the Atlantic. It includes the United States and Canada, and it includes the western countries of Europe, Great Britain and France, and there was Holland and Luxembourg and Belgium and West Germany and Italy, and there was NATO. And NATO was born, and out of it came, and it was only maybe 5 or 6 years after the end of the Second World War. Germans, French, British, and Americans were cooperating on military purposes. Do you understand? A kind of unified military command. That is, there was an American supreme commander, and he now controlled the what? All these armies, but the British, the French, and the West Germans and the Italians were now forced to what? To come together. Their dream was not European unity. Their dream was fight the communists. But sometimes you start something from one purpose and it ends up being used what? For another purpose. Now, the next trigger, obviously, had to do with Germany, West Germany. And let me talk about Konrad Adenauer and his vision. Konrad Adenauer had been the mayor of Cologne. He had gotten into trouble with Adolf Hitler. He had offered some kind of resistance. He ultimately was regarded as a politically acceptable person to be the leader of West Germany. Now, West Germany was very small territorially. It included the greater part of what was left of Germany. I mean, the eastern part had been given to Poland. And Adenauer developed a vision, and the vision was very important. West Germany by itself could not be very important. But West Germany as one of the what? Major factors in a unified Western Europe, well, that could be very important, and economically that could be very significant, because West Germany had to start from scratch in recreating its industry. And in fact, the markets for that industry would be far better or far greater if there was some level of unification. Now, Adenauer found a compatriot. Adenauer was very pro-American, but he understood the French. The French, yes, they hated the communists, yes, they wanted to resist, but those Americans. So the way to get to the French is to suggest that you will create something that might lessen American control. And the way you do that is to say, well, France on its own cannot be America. But what if the impossible happened? What if the impossible happened? I'm given the history of Europe in the last century. What if the French and the Germans could get together? And what if we could create a united economy? Now, I mean, never, never, never merge the two people, please. The French are French and the Germans are German. But what if we brought their economies together? Oh. And then you'd have the beginning of, do you understand, of a powerful, unified economy. So out of that, you add the Italians to the idea, and certainly the Dutch and the Belgians. You understand the problem of the Dutch. The Dutch are a highly industrious people. Their problem is they live on a very, very small piece of land. This industrious people has produced wonderful corporations of manufacturing and all kinds of industries, chemical, in terms of engineering, all things, and electrical. And now to the Dutch. If you only have a Dutch economy surrounded by tariffs, But now the Adenauer opening the discussion was joined by the Dutch, who were very attracted to it. Because if you could create a united Western European economy, the Dutch would what? Sail. Let California join the Union, has got the what? Right? Let Florida join the Union, there it is. I mean, the possibilities were enormous. So, and the same thing applied to Belgium. So in the end, it was from Western Germany that an idea emerged that was to follow NATO. And by 1955, in the signing of the Treaty of Rome, it was very clear. France and West Germany and Holland and Belgium and Italy ultimately were to come together into what's called this European Economic Community. The possibilities of which were not fully realized. It was like the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. You remember when that happened? Just a few years ago. I mean, if you had ever told Americans at that time that we might be creating a new continent in which Mexicans could move anywhere they wanted to, you would what? The end. Do you understand? The end. But you would say, no. All we're talking about are goods. Socks. You want socks to cross. Shirts. Not people. Never people, please, But it's the beginning, it's like a beginning of an idea. And so by the middle 50s, there emerged this thing. Who could believe it? The Germans and the French were together. They tried to persuade the British to join. The French didn't want the British to join. Adenauer wanted the British. He felt they were a significant power, and after all, they should be in there. The French, no, hated the English. I mean, the French historically have hated the English more than the Germans. So. I mean, if you look at the wars for century after century in Europe between the English and the French, and when the English talk about the French, they have worse things to say than when they talk about the Germans. So the English were to be out, and that was reinforced by the fact the British arrogance. It's still there. We don't join any union. We still have the empire. What empire? There was no empire. It's gone. I mean, India was gone 1947, 1940. It was gone. But they were defending themselves against what they had become. And they were to resist for over a decade before they finally surrendered to the idea that emerged in the European economic community. One of the triggers, obviously, was all these European countries lost their empires. The British lost their empire. De Gaulle just realized that it had to go, dismissed the empire in 1960, and all these countries suddenly emerged as theoretically independent. And the loss of the empire meant that each of these countries began to feel very small. See, at one time, England was just this little island, but it was pink all over the map. Now it's just a little island. And France is just this little country, and Germany this little place. So the loss of empire refocused the attention now of European powers on their European setting. One of the triggers, and it's very important, the wars in Western Europe were the result of religion for several centuries. Catholics hated Protestants, Protestants hated Catholics, so long as you have intense religious feeling, you can't bring these countries together. But at the end of the Second World War, what emerged in Europe is what you now see. In most countries like France and England and Holland and Denmark and Norway and Sweden, nobody goes to church. Church is for tourists. They take pictures. And the reason you can take pictures is because there's nobody there. If there were people there, you couldn't take pictures. You can take pictures anytime, anywhere, or whatever you want to do. I mean, it's the secularization of Western Europe. With the reduction of what we call religious provocation, do you understand? It now makes it easier to unify, where at one time it was very, very difficult. And now you have global capitalism. Well, global capitalism was evidenced by the fact that already by the 50s and 60s, European corporations, French corporations or German corporations, were now establishing markets all over Europe and all over the world, and in some cases beginning to establish subsidiary factories in other countries in Europe and elsewhere. The arrival of global capitalism reinforced this attempt to transcend national boundaries, and that was reinforced by technology. Technology. You're in London. You want to have, it's lunch. You want to have dinner in Frankfurt. You go to the airport. You can go to, if you only wait for breakfast, you can get on the train. And go what? Right through the channel. You want to go to the TGV? The TGV travels at over 110 miles an hour. We should only have trains like this. If you look at the transportation, and then the arrival of the new communication, whether it be the telephone or certainly the arrival of the computer and the internet, one of the triggers was the power of American culture. Wherever you go in Europe today, you're aware of the power of the United States of America, the most successful European cultured country in the world. In France now, 91% of all movies shown are American. The French hate it. Wherever you go, Montparnasse, Montmartre, wherever you go in Paris, it's all American movies. The French government subsidizes the French film industry, hoping to produce French films, whatever it be. But the French like to watch, they hate the Americans, but they love to what? Watch American film. In the end, the music, the films, whatever, but you cross the border to West Germany, they're showing the what? The same films, you're listening to the what? To the same music. So in the end, the presence of America, the power of America, its economy and its culture create a kind of unity, that Americanization process. One of the triggers was that ultimately all the countries in Western Europe modeled themselves politically after the United States of America. Took a while for the West Germans to learn how to do it, but it didn't take them too long. They now run a what? A democracy pretty much on Western standards. The British didn't have to learn because they had what? They had started the whole thing. That's where the Americans got it from. So in the end, so now what you have, and this is American culture, it is the great emphasis on the individual and individual rights. And that's reinforced certainly by the fact that labor has become mobile. So you have to understand what happens to families. When you have farm families and you have to spend the rest of your life with your mother and father, the way you talk to your mother and father is entirely different from if you're raised in a house, they pay for your education, and then you leave. You have to understand behavior totally alters, and all of a sudden you're into this new economy. So if you have strong, intense families, you can build strong, intense nationalism. Because nationalism is simply the extension of the family, the clan, the tribe, the nation. But once you've got floating individuals running around saying, am I happy, am I not happy, will I be happier in Rotterdam, will I be happier in Paris, is it better on the Riviera? I mean, where'd you get those people? You're not going to be able to mobilize nationalism in the same way. And that's true in Western Europe today. And that's certainly reinforced by prosperity. Prosperity allowed people to focus on improving their own lives. When you can't give people any prosperity, then what they settle for is our slogans. Glory for the nation. But once they get a few vacations. All right. And now what happened because of prosperity was there's a labor shortage because the more liberal people become, the fewer babies they have. So now Western Europe isn't producing a labor force that it needs for all this industry that's developing. So now you have to what? Import labor. The first labor you import is European. You get Yugoslavs, Serbs and Croats and Slovenes to come what? Work in Germany or wherever else you want. And then you may even, if you're desperate, turn to North Africa. Or Asia. And all of that is reinforced by the fact that thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who used to belong to your empire and speak your language now want to come out of their poverty to live in your country. So it was, remember the 60s? All of a sudden the Indians and Pakistanis, you arrived in Heathrow? No, do you remember the radical change in London? You could walk for miles and there are no Anglo-Saxons. And in France, as a result of the war in Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, the whole thing, they what? They poured into France. So now what you're getting is what makes an American neighborhood. Now what you're getting is all this, this mixing. But one of the main things was the war had left this vacuum. And basically America and people like Adenauer and de Gaulle moved into the vacuum to try to create a structure that was there, and in some cases without great deliberation about the great vision, produced the foundation of what we call this European Union, which isn't dissolved, which only grows strong. So let me talk about the consequences. The consequence, of course, was the creation of the European Economic Community, the Union, and that triggered on the Soviet side the creation of something that didn't work, but at least there was a sense of solidarity, called the Warsaw Pact, where they brought all those powers, the Poles together and the Czechs together and the Hungarians together with the Russians. The third consequence, and it's mind-boggling, but somebody at the break was telling me he was in Rotterdam and just noticing all these trucks from Poland and Belarus, and I mean, it's back and forth and back and forth. It's called free trade. The tariff walls have what? Crumbled. You make something now in England, you can what? Sell it with no penalty in Germany, in France, in Holland, in Belgium, whatever else it is. Well, that's like the United States, right? You make it in California, you sell it in Wisconsin, you sell it in Indiana. Whoever thought that would be possible? The history of Europe was to defend one's nation by putting up these enormously high tariff barriers. They've come down, and the next thing that followed was the free movement of people, the thing they didn't mention initially. Now they talk about it. There are two lines when you arrive now in Europe. The line for those outsiders and then the line for Europeans. Europeans don't even have to show anything almost. If you have a European identification, you just sail right through. Never a visa, no requirement of any kind. If I am Portuguese, I can go anywhere. And the European market has now increased over the years. Before, it included just France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany and Italy. But now it includes Great Britain. Why would they want to be left out of the goodies? Whom are they going to trade with? The Canadians? I don't know. All right. Great Britain, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Austria. They have Denmark, Sweden, Finland. They've all been admitted into the European Economic Community. If I'm Portuguese and I want to go live in Finland, it's a little cold, but if I wanted to, I was into saunas and things like that. If I wanted to, do you understand? I can go. If I'm French and the employment is bad in Paris, it's happened. When you go to London now, you hear a lot of French. There are lots of French professionals now who've chosen to live in England. The wages were better, and when the economy was bad in France, they crossed over. People are everywhere. You can buy homes anywhere. You're German, you want to have a home in southern Italy, you're English, you want to have a home on here the Costa del Sol in Spain, whatever, just like. In fact, southern Italy and Spain have become the Florida and California of Europe. And it's all being transformed. See, tourists go there, they want to find the French, the German. I mean, they're all fading into, they're all merging with a lot of American culture and something else. And now there's a new capital for Europe. They had to choose it. The French wanted Paris. De Gaulle said, "What other city, please? Most beautiful city in the world." But the Germans wouldn't have it, and the Dutch wouldn't have it. So they ultimately picked a small country who offended nobody. And they made Brussels one of the ugliest cities in Europe. The capital of Europe, and there's a European Commission, which is very, very powerful, controlling the rules and regulations that govern this joint European economy. And then they added a European Parliament. And they gave the French a concession. They gave the French a parliament that didn't meet in Paris, but on a city that had been formerly German, on the Rhine River, called Strasbourg. And there is the European Parliament building, and whether you know it or not, they now hold, and they have for a couple decades, they hold separate elections for the European Parliament. That is, you vote for your own parliament in your own country, and you also vote for the European Parliament. Now, obviously, the European Parliament does not have even a smidgen of the power that the American Congress has. But the very fact that it exists, the very fact that there are political parties running these elections, the very fact that there are candidates now, winning candidates, meeting with each other in Strasbourg, is a revolution. Do you understand? It's a revolution. These people were killing each other. Only a few years ago, they had left the center of Europe a hole, a devastated hole. And now court systems are emerging. And in fact, the European courts are now able to rule on the behavior of nations as to whether they comply to the economic requirements of the European Economic Union. And now, beginning of 1999, it came into existence. When you get your little check in the restaurant, they can give it to you in francs, but they'll also give it to you in euros. The euro or the euro is the new currency, and pretty soon it'll be something you have in your hand. The franc will go, the mark will go. Not all the members of the European Economic Union have consented to accept the euro. The British are what? Holdouts. They want the pound. How can you be British without the pound? The point is, the euro has not behaved on the international markets as sensationally as they had expected. But it's there, and it's there to stay. Now, once you have the same money, do you understand what, I mean, this vision is suddenly turning into something real. And a survey was taken in Germany among young Germans under 30 about whether they felt more German or more European. Over 35% said they felt more European. I mean, it's a revolution. If I said to Americans today, do you feel more American or more North American? We're not there yet. But in Europe, after 40 or 45 years, that's where they are. Now, there are lots of challenges to this, and let me mention them. First is people don't like to change. People love to hate. They really do. They don't want to give up hating the people they've hated for a long, long time. It's not easy for the French to give up hating the English and the Germans. I mean, it's so comfortable. It's just part of your mentality. Isn't it nice? It's nice to have a few enemies you can really hate. All right, so there's all this nationalism, and that's expressed by what's happening in Britain. Tony Blair, who is the Prime Minister of Britain, this rather dashing young Prime Minister who came to power in 1997 with a European-friendly policy, he's in favor of adopting the euro. But his opponent is this sort of stodgy, he always looks mean. His name is William Hague. Ever see his picture? And Hague looks like he always has a Union Jack in one hand, and he's got this sort of dark look. And we'll never give up the pound. We're part of the European Economic Union, but we're not going to surrender British identity, the whole thing. The point is that Hague is way down in the polls, because quite frankly, he doesn't have any alternative. What is the alternative? To fully join. Standing on the side simply means you'll be what? Punished and penalized. What's the alternative? Joining Canada and Iceland in a union? What are you talking about? And the one thing that keeps the pound still in the discussion is that the pound has remained strong. The British economy has been fairly good. And so there's that. The strongest challenge is what the free movement of peoples means to Europe, and I would like to talk about that because it applies to America. The great challenge to America, and we haven't fully recovered, are all these new people moving in. The last group that moves in wants nobody else to come in. The last group. They all forget they were immigrants. No, they all forget they were immigrants. The next group, never. Those Mexicans, they better not cross the border. They better not come in here at all. We hate them. The point is, it's unavoidable, because if your birth rates are too low and you're not producing a sufficient labor supply with prosperity to do menial work, somebody's got to do the what? The menial work. So you're going to import these people anyway. So that's what's happened. And throughout Western Europe now, there are political parties representing somewhere around 15% of the population. That's where it stands in each country, who have what we call fascist, racist slogans Le Pen in France, ship those Algerians back. France for the French. Well, what was discovered was that he had 3 Algerian maids cleaning his house. So who's going to clean it? No. Mrs. Le Pen doesn't want to clean anymore. I mean, she doesn't want to clean it. So, ship them back. Fortunately, his party is split in 2. There was a dispute in the party. In Britain also, there are several racist and nationalist parties. In Germany, that's recently been dramatized. The National Democratic Party, which has been reinforced by the levels of unemployment in East Germany as a result of joining the capitalistic world and the Soviet-style industry being totally unredeemable. There's high unemployment, and many of these people coming out of the Soviet system do not have any entrepreneurial sense. They simply are waiting for jobs. And into the midst of them come people with entrepreneurial skills. They're called Turks. Some of them even come from Angola, who knows? They open up little shops and little bars and little places and whatever else it is, and they're busy working. They could be Vietnamese, and these people hate them. Isn't that the reason? So the newspapers are filled with all these incidents. In recent years, close to 70,000 Russian Jews have moved from Russia to Germany. And now creating not a substantial, but a somewhat substantial Jewish population again in Germany. And now there were these incidents, right? Russian Jews got off the train in Dusseldorf, and there was this bomb and whatever. It's all part of this response to mixing. But we have it in America. Do we have it in America? And it won't stop, because in order for it to stop, you'd have to wind down the economy. You need the labor. These are people willing to work for wages that most likely the native-born are not willing to work for. It's one of the issues. You have it in Iowa. Did you read about Iowa? The governor of Iowa, they're welcoming foreigners because people are leaving and the birth rate is low, and who's going to do the menial work? So now you have that anti-foreign. One of the things is the fall of communism. The fall of communism aggravated the problem, because now there are all these countries that used to be communist that all want to join the European Economic Union. You have to understand. If you join the Union, you get benefits. There are subsidies for farmers, for instance. The French and German farmers arranged for that. Well, it was hard enough swallowing Spain and Portugal and Greece, but swallowing Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, with the poverty that exists there, the cost to the European Economic Union would be absolutely overwhelming. So there's a line now. They're all lining up. They all want to join the what? The European Economic Union. And now Lithuania wants to join, Latvia wants to join, Estonia wants to join. And now the issue is not how do you persuade them to join, but how do you what? Keep them waiting in line until you can afford to have them join. One of the major issues, obviously, is the cost of labor in the European Economic Union. There is an attempt on the part of the Central Commission in Brussels to enforce a certain level of welfare standards throughout the European Economic Union, which have been resisted by the British, who say the strength of our economy lies in the fact that we don't have the high welfare supports that exist in places like Germany and France. What has happened in Europe is that labor in places like Germany and France has become very, very expensive. And if the European Economic Union is to be successful somehow or other, it has to have less expensive labor or more productive labor. You have to understand what happens now in France and Germany. They're on a vacation everywhere you look. And by the way, I don't begrudge them that, because I'm on vacation too. You know, go on a long trip. I'm not saying that. The point is, if the European Economic Union doesn't do something about the cost of labor, then obviously manufacturing will be alienated to other places as well. And there are the recurring problems of Turkey wants to join. Is Turkey European? Well, there's a little piece of Turkey that's in Europe. But Turkey is what? Muslim. Oh, well, but Bosnia is Muslim. Can Muslims be part of a European Union? And now the next country that wants to join, because they obviously won't join a Middle Eastern Union, is Israel. The Israelis say, well, we're basically European in culture. Is Israel European? Or see the question? I mean, all of a sudden, once you got the organization going, you've got all these questions. Well, what's emerging? What's emerging is, and it most likely is not reversible. You're going to have screaming and shouting and nationalist parties, and you're going to have bombs thrown against foreigners and whatever else. A United States of Europe is beginning to emerge. It most likely will take another 75 to 100 years to complete it. And I certainly am not going to be, maybe you will, I'm not going to be around to witness that, but it's on the way. And you won't recognize the population. You'll go to London, and London will be filled with people from what? Spain, Portugal, Greece, whatever. Everything is going to be mixed up in the way you go to Los Angeles, and I bump into Michiganders. Okay, fine. You're going to have a more multilingual continent, but the prevailing world language, which most likely will be the language, the prevailing language in Europe for most purposes, will be English, although the French and Germans will offer a great deal of resistance. You're going to have a lot of Asian and African imports because the European nations alone will not be able to provide the cheap labor that will be required to make the European economy work. And what will ultimately develop, and you can see it happening already, is what makes tourism more difficult. You can tell the difference sometimes between the hotel in London and the hotel in Frankfurt. And you're in a uniform culture, dominated to a large degree by the things you thought you were getting away from: American music, American films, and American television. And in the process, what is happening is something very interesting. Since the nation state is no longer necessary, parts of the nation state now want to separate from it. For instance, if you're Scottish, why do you have to be part of Great Britain? Just be part of Europe, right? And let Scotland be what? Separate. If you're Welsh, if you're Basque, if you're Catalan, whatever else, why do you be part of Spain if you're Catalan? Just be part of what? Part of Europe. And so now you have all these demands from regions within nations for more autonomy and, in fact, demands for separation. And last, what is emerging? It's that dream that started with the Roman Empire. Do you understand? And got waylaid, whatever it was, and diverted. And in the middle of the century, we thought it would never happen, right? What is emerging is an identity. It's a new identity. Today, it's just the name of a currency, euro or euro. But ultimately, in 50 to 60 years and earlier, many people living in Europe will come to simply refer to themselves as Europeans. In the global economy, that will be their niche, not simply French, German, English. This dream coming into fruition, and every time I travel to Europe, I see more and more of it taking place. Do I like it? I love it. I don't mind some of the uniformity. I know it takes away from the tourism. But on the other hand, people coming together who used to kill each other. I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very, very much.